The champagne in Thandi Cumulo's glass caught the Johannesburg sunset like liquid gold, but she barely noticed. She stood on the terrace of her Sandhurst mansion, surveying the city that had once rejected her and now bent to her will, and felt nothing but the familiar hollow ache that no amount of success had ever managed to fill. At 52, she controlled a mining empire that stretched from the platinum fields of Rustenburg to the diamond operations in Kimberley, owned the largest privately held renewable energy company in sub-Saharan Africa, and held enough political influence to make cabinet ministers return her calls within the hour. Forbes had called her the Iron Queen. Business Day had labeled her untouchable. Her ex-husband, in the bitter months before their divorce 7 years ago, had called her something far less flattering, something that boiled down to a single truth she couldn't deny: cold. But coldness, Thandi had learned, was simply discipline by another name. It was survival. It was the armor she'd forged in the township outside Durban where she'd grown up, where her mother had cleaned white people's houses for wages that wouldn't buy a single bottle of the wine Thandi now served at dinner parties, where her father had drunk himself into an early grave muttering about dignity and apartheid and broken promises. Coldness was what had gotten her through university on scholarships and spite, through the early years of her career when male colleagues had assumed she was someone's secretary, through building her first mining operation with investors who'd expected her to fail and seemed almost disappointed when she'd succeeded beyond their wildest projections. Coldness was what had carried her through a marriage that had looked perfect in the society pages, but had died quietly in the spaces between words, in separate bedrooms and separate lives, and the eventual realization that her husband had wanted a wife, and she had become an empire instead. The doorbell chimed, an elegant sound that echoed through rooms filled with art she'd acquired not because she loved it, but because powerful people were supposed to appreciate such things. Thandi checked her reflection in the glass, adjusting the elegant wrap dress that had cost more than her mother had earned in a year, touching the diamonds at her throat that had come from her own mines. At 52, she was still beautiful in that severe, commanding way that made men uncomfortable and women cautious. Her skin was smooth dark mahogany, her cheekbones sharp enough to cut, her eyes the kind of deep brown that missed nothing. She'd learned to weaponize her beauty the same way she'd weaponized everything else, turning it into another tool of intimidation, another barrier between herself and a world that had tried to diminish her. Her assistant had arranged this meeting, though Thandi couldn't recall exactly why. Something about a new sustainability consultant, someone with impressive credentials from Cambridge and a track record of helping corporations navigate the increasingly complex landscape of environmental regulation and social responsibility. Thandi had built her fortune on mining, but she was pragmatic enough to know that the future required a different kind of extraction, a different kind of power. Hence the renewable energy investments, the carefully orchestrated pivot toward respectability and environmental consciousness that would protect her legacy and expand her influence into the next generation of industry. She descended the curved staircase with the measured pace of someone who'd learned never to hurry, never to show eagerness or need or anything that might be mistaken for weakness. Her heels clicked against Italian marble that had been imported at obscene expense, past walls hung with works by Zainal Muholi and William Kentridge, through rooms that whispered of wealth so profound it no longer needed to announce itself. Her housekeeper Grace was showing the visitor into the study, and Thandi heard his voice before she saw him, a warm baritone with the rounded vowels of private school education, and something underneath that suggested complexity, layers, a life that hadn't been entirely smooth. When she entered the study, he turned, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Thandi Cumulo felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 35, with the kind of lean, athletic build that spoke of someone who actually used their gym membership rather than simply possessing one. His skin was a few shades lighter than hers, that particular brown that suggested mixed heritage in a country still navigating the complicated mathematics of racial identity. His suit was well cut but not ostentatious, charcoal grey with a subtle pinstripe, and he wore it with an ease that suggested comfort rather than costume. But it was his face that arrested her, the high cheekbones and full mouth, the intelligence in dark eyes that met hers directly without the usual calculation she encountered, without trying to assess her net worth or measure his chances or determine how to leverage this meeting to his advantage. "Mrs. Cumulo," he said, extending his hand. "Elwazi di Lamini, thank you for seeing me." "Ms. Cumulo," she corrected, taking his hand. His grip was firm, warm, and she released it perhaps a fraction of a second slower than professional courtesy required. "I haven't been Mrs. Anything for 7 years." Something flickered in his eyes, amusement maybe, or interest. "My apologies, Ms. Cumulo. Your assistant mentioned you were interested in discussing environmental strategy for your mining operations." Thandi gestured to the leather chairs arranged near the fireplace, expensive Italian pieces that managed to be both beautiful and uncomfortable, which she'd always found useful in business meetings. People who were slightly uncomfortable made decisions more quickly, agreed to terms more readily, left sooner. But as Elwazi settled into his chair with easy grace, pulling out a tablet and a leather portfolio that showed signs of actual use rather than being a mere prop, she found herself hoping this meeting might last longer than usual. "I'm interested in protecting my interests," Thandi said, pouring them each a glass of whiskey from the decanter on the side table. "Expensive single malt, the kind that smoothed away rough edges. Environmental regulation is tightening. Social pressure is mounting. I built my fortune on extraction, but I'm pragmatic enough to know that the future requires a different approach." "Pragmatism is underrated," Elwazi said, accepting the glass. "Most people in your position wait until they're facing lawsuits or protests before they consider adaptation." "Most people in my position were born into it," Thandi replied. "They didn't have to fight for every rand, every contract, every shred of legitimacy. They have the luxury of ignoring reality until it forces their attention. I don't." He studied her over the rim of his glass, and she felt that gaze like a physical touch, assessing but not judging, curious but not intrusive. "You started with nothing," he said. "It wasn't a question." "Less than nothing. I started with everyone assuming I would fail." She sipped her whiskey, let the burn ground her. "Is this the part where you tell me your own bootstrap story, where we bond over shared struggle and I feel comfortable enough to trust you with my business?" His laugh was unexpected, genuine, and it transformed his face from handsome to something more dangerous. "I'm not going to insult your intelligence with false commonality," he said. "My grandfather was a teacher, my mother a nurse. We were comfortable, not wealthy, but I never went hungry. I went to good schools, played rugby, got into Cambridge on merit and family connections both. I'm not going to pretend I climbed the same mountain you did." His honesty surprised her, and surprise was a sensation Thandi had nearly forgotten. People usually lied to her, or flattered her, or tried to manipulate her with carefully constructed narratives designed to appeal to her ego or her guilt, or her sense of tribal loyalty. They didn't simply tell the truth and let it stand unadorned. "Then why should I hire you?" she asked. "If you don't understand where I've been, how can you help me determine where I'm going?" "Because I understand where the world is going," Elwazi said, leaning forward, "and because I'm more interested in your future than your past. You've already proven you can build an empire. The question is whether you can transform one." They talked for 2 hours, and somewhere in the discussion of carbon credits and renewable energy certificates, and the complex politics of mining rights in an ANC government, increasingly pressured by youth movements demanding economic transformation, Thandi realized she was enjoying herself. Not in the predatory way she enjoyed crushing competitors or the satisfied way she enjoyed closing a profitable deal, but in some simpler, more fundamental way she'd almost forgotten existed. Elwazi was brilliant, that was obvious within the first 10 minutes, but he was also funny and irreverent and willing to challenge her assumptions without being dismissive of her expertise. He asked questions that revealed he'd done his research, knew her company's histories, understood her strategic positioning, but he also listened when she answered, actually listened rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. When Grace appeared to announce that dinner was ready, a light supper Thandi hadn't actually ordered, but that her housekeeper had taken the initiative to prepare, it seemed natural to invite him to stay. And when they moved to the dining room, to the table that usually sat 12 but was now set intimately for 2 at one end, it seemed natural to open another bottle of wine and continue their conversation beyond business into philosophy, politics, the state of the nation and the weight of history, and the ways power corrupted and the ways it liberated. Elwazi had opinions, strong ones, but he held them lightly, with humor and self-awareness, willing to be wrong, curious about her perspective even when they disagreed. "You voted for Ramaphosa?" he asked, when the conversation had wound its way to the complicated landscape of South African politics and the eternal question of whether reform was possible within the ANC or whether the party had become too captured by corruption to save itself. "I voted for stability," Thandi said. "I voted for someone who understands business, who won't destroy the economy in service of ideology. I spent too many years building what I have to watch it crumble because some populist decides mining is theft and property is colonialism." Even though mining has been theft, even though property was colonialism, Elwazi's tone was gentle, curious rather than accusatory. "Yes," Thandi met his eyes, "because I stole it back, because I took what they said I couldn't have and made it mine. That's not the same as justice, I know that, but it's power, and power is the only thing that's ever protected people who look like me." "Power," Elwazi repeated slowly, as if tasting the word. "Is that what you wanted? When you were young, when you were starting out, was it always about power?" No one had ever asked her that before. They asked about her first deal, her strategy, her vision for expansion. They asked about obstacles she'd overcome and competitors she'd defeated. They never asked what she'd actually wanted, what desire had driven her through all those years of grinding work and strategic marriages and carefully calculated risks. "I wanted not to be afraid," Thandi said finally, and the honesty of it surprised her. "I wanted never to be helpless again, and power, I learned, was the only insurance against helplessness." Something shifted in his expression, softened. "And did it work? Do you feel safe now?" The question landed with unexpected weight. Thandi looked around her dining room, at the art and the crystal and the evidence of wealth so immense it could survive market crashes and political upheaval. She thought of her security team and her lawyers and her political connections and her carefully diversified portfolio. She thought of all the structures she'd built to protect herself, all the walls she'd erected, all the distance she'd created between herself and anything that might hurt her. "I feel alone," she said quietly, "which is perhaps another kind of safety." Elwazi didn't look away, didn't change the subject, didn't offer platitudes or false comfort. He simply nodded as if he understood, as if loneliness were a country he'd visited himself. And in that moment, Thandi felt something crack in the careful facade she maintained, some small fissure in the armor she'd spent decades perfecting. It was after midnight when he finally left, and Thandi stood in her doorway watching his taillights disappear down her long driveway, feeling strangely bereft. The house seemed larger in his absence, emptier, and she climbed the stairs to her bedroom with the uncomfortable awareness that she wanted to call him back, wanted to continue their conversation, wanted something she couldn't quite name but that pulsed through her veins like need. She hired him the next day, though they both knew the decision had been made long before the formal contract. And if anyone on her team thought it strange that she was bringing on a sustainability consultant for operations that had functioned profitably for 20 years without one, they were too well paid and too intimidated to question her judgment. The work was legitimate, undeniably so. Elwazi was exactly as brilliant as his credentials suggested, and over the following weeks he proved his worth a dozen times over, identifying regulatory risks her own legal team had missed, proposing strategic pivots that would position her companies favorably for the inevitable tightening of environmental standards, building relationships with NGOs and community groups that had previously viewed her operations with suspicion or hostility. He traveled to her mine sites, spent days in the platinum operations near Rustenburg, where the rock ran deep and dangerous and men still died, with depressing regularity despite all her safety protocols. He visited her renewable energy installations, the wind farms in the Eastern Cape and the solar arrays in the Northern Cape that were slowly transforming her from an extractive villain into a green energy visionary. He attended meetings with her executive team, sat in on conference calls with government officials, accompanied her to a mining industry conference in Cape Town, where his presence at her side raised eyebrows and started whispers. Because somewhere in those weeks, their professional relationship had begun to shift into something else, something neither of them acknowledged but both of them felt. It started small, innocuously, his hand on her elbow guiding her through a crowd at the conference, her fingers brushing his as she passed him a document during a meeting, the way their eyes would meet across a boardroom table and hold a fraction too long. The way she found herself dressing more carefully on days when she knew she'd see him, choosing colors that brought out the depth of her skin, wearing perfume that was subtle but present, letting her hair fall loose rather than pulling it back in her usual severe style. And he responded in ways that were careful but unmistakable. The way he listened when she spoke, with an attention that felt like being truly seen for the first time in years. The way he laughed at her dry observations, getting her humor in a way most people didn't. The way he challenged her respectfully but firmly when he disagreed with her approach, treating her like an intellectual equal rather than a powerful woman who needed to be managed or placated. The way he stayed late after meetings, finding reasons to linger, to continue conversations that had stopped being about business and started being about everything else. If you've ever felt that particular kind of tension, that exquisite awareness of someone else's presence that makes the air feel charged and heavy, you'll understand what those weeks were like. If you've ever known the specific torture of wanting someone you shouldn't want, of feeling desire you can't act on because the consequences would be too high, too complicated, too destructive, then you know the private torment Thandi experienced. And if you understand that torment, if you've lived in that space between duty and desire, then stay with me, because this is the part where everything begins to unravel. The shift from emotional intimacy to something more dangerous happened on a Thursday night in early autumn, when Johannesburg's famous Highveld sky was turning brilliant orange and purple with sunset. They'd been working late at her office in Sandton, the gleaming tower that bore her name in subtle steel letters, reviewing environmental impact assessments for a proposed expansion of her mining operations in Limpopo. It was tedious work, necessary but mind-numbing, and they'd ordered dinner from a nearby restaurant, expensive sushi, that arrived in elegant boxes, and that they ate with their shoes kicked off, sitting on the floor of her office with papers spread around them like some graduate school study session, rather than a meeting of consultant and client in a multi-billion-rand empire. "Tell me something true," El-Wazi said suddenly, setting down his chopsticks. They'd finished the reports, finished the wine, and were lingering in that comfortable space beyond productivity where conversation became confession. "What kind of true?" Thandi asked. She was pleasantly buzzed. Relaxed in a way she rarely allowed herself to be. Something you don't tell interviewers or journalists or people at cocktail parties. Something real. Thandi considered him, this man who'd somehow worked his way past her defenses without her quite noticing when it happened. "I'm lonely," she said. Devastatingly, crushingly lonely in a way that has nothing to do with being alone and everything to do with never being truly known. "Because you won't let people know you," El-Wazi said gently. "Because you've built walls so high that nobody can scale them." "Because people don't want to know me," Thandi corrected. "They want to know my bank balance. They want access to my network. They want what I can do for them. Nobody's interested in who I am when I'm not the Iron Queen." "I am," El-Wazi said, and the simplicity of it, the directness, made her breath catch. "You work for me," Thandi said, trying to keep her tone light, professional. "You're paid to be interested." "I'm paid to consult on environmental strategy," El-Wazi replied. "Nobody's paying me to care that you've read every book by Nadine Gordimer, even though you disagree with half her politics. Nobody's paying me to notice that you drink your coffee with too much sugar and not enough milk, because that's how your mother made it and it reminds you of her. Nobody's paying me to remember that you're allergic to shellfish, or that you're afraid of flying but you do it anyway, because showing fear would be showing weakness. I'm interested in you, Thandi, not your empire." The use of her first name, which he'd never done before, which nobody in her professional life ever did, landed with unexpected intimacy. And the fact that he'd noticed all those small details, had paid attention to the person beneath the position, made something twist in her chest that felt dangerously close to hope. "You're young enough to be my son," Thandi said, but it came out wrong, too vulnerable, more revelation than rejection. "I'm 36, Elwazi said, old enough to know my own mind, and you're 52, not dead. Why should age matter if we want the same thing?" "What do you think I want?" Thandi's voice was barely a whisper. "To be wanted," Elwazi said, "not for what you have or what you can provide, just for yourself, the way I want you." The confession hung between them, dangerous and thrilling, and Thandi knew she should shut this down, should remind him of professional boundaries and power dynamics, and all the very good reasons why this was impossible. But instead, she reached out and touched his face, traced the line of his jaw with fingers that trembled slightly, and watched his eyes darken with desire that mirrored her own. "This is a terrible idea," she whispered. "Probably," he agreed, but he was leaning closer, his hand coming up to cover hers where it rested against his cheek. "I could ruin your career. I could ruin your reputation." "We shouldn't," Thandi said, but she was tilting her face up, her lips parting slightly. "No," Elwazi agreed, "we absolutely shouldn't." But he kissed her anyway, and she kissed him back, and in that moment every wall she'd built came crashing down. His mouth was warm and insistent and tasted faintly of wine, and his hands were in her hair, gentle but possessive, and she made a sound she didn't recognize, something needy and desperate that she'd never allowed herself to make before. The kiss deepened, became urgent, and she pulled him closer, her fingers digging into his shoulders through the expensive fabric of his shirt. Time seemed to collapse, the world narrowing to sensation and desire, and the exquisite relief of finally giving in to something she wanted rather than something she should want. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Thandi felt shaken in a way that had nothing to do with physical desire and everything to do with emotional exposure. She'd just crossed a line she could never uncross, had revealed a need she could never again successfully hide. "I should go," Elwazi said, but he didn't move, his forehead resting against hers, his hands still framing her face. "Yes," Thandi agreed, but neither of them moved for a long moment, both trapped in that space between wanting and having, between possibility and consequence. When he did finally leave, after one more kiss that promised everything and resolved nothing, Thandi sat alone in her office and tried to remember all the reasons why this was impossible, why she couldn't have this, couldn't want this, couldn't let herself fall into something so dangerous and intoxicating and potentially destructive. But all she could think about was the way he'd looked at her, the way he'd said her name, the way he'd seen her not as the Iron Queen but as simply Thandi, a woman who was lonely and longing and alive in ways she'd forgotten she could be. The affair, because that's what it became even though she tried desperately to tell herself it wasn't, unfolded with an inevitability that felt both thrilling and terrifying. They tried to maintain professional boundaries, truly they did. They kept their interactions public and appropriate during business hours, maintained careful distance in meetings, communicated through proper channels about proper topics. But the boundaries eroded with every shared glance, every accidental touch, every late-night phone call that started about work and ended somewhere far more personal. Thandi told herself she was managing the risk, that she was being strategic and careful. She told herself that as long as they were discreet, as long as nobody knew, the situation was containable. She told herself a lot of things in those first few weeks, lies that got easier with repetition, rationalizations that almost sounded reasonable in her own head. The first time they were together, truly together in the way that left no room for pretense or professional distance, was at her wine estate in Stellenbosch, 3 hours from Johannesburg in the Western Cape's impossibly beautiful wine country. She'd bought the property 5 years ago, a working vineyard with a historic manor house that dated back to the Dutch colonial period, renovated at enormous expense to combine old-world elegance with modern luxury. It was her retreat, her escape from the demands of business, and the suffocating pressure of being Thandi Khumalo, the Iron Queen who couldn't show weakness or need, or anything approaching normal human vulnerability. She'd invited El-Wazi under the pretense of reviewing environmental practices at the vineyard, which needed to be updated to meet the increasingly stringent sustainability standards for wine production. It was a legitimate business reason, one that would satisfy her assistant's questions and El-Wazi's own professional ethics. But they both knew it was also something else, some unspoken acknowledgement that they needed time away from Johannesburg, from watchful eyes and business obligations, and all the structures that reminded them why this was impossible. They arrived separately, maintaining the fiction of propriety, but the fiction didn't last much beyond the first evening. They had dinner on the terrace overlooking the vineyards, rows of perfectly ordered vines stretching toward mountains that glowed purple in the sunset. The food was exceptional, prepared by the estate's chef from local ingredients, served with wines from her own cellars that had won international awards. But Thandi barely tasted any of it, too aware of El-Wazi across the table, of the way candlelight softened his features, of the way his eyes kept finding hers with an intensity that made her skin feel too warm. After dinner, they walked through the vineyards as the stars emerged, brilliant against the vast African sky, and talked about everything except what was happening between them. They talked about wine production and climate change and the complicated economics of farming in the new South Africa. They talked about his work and her expansion plans and the political situation, and whether the country could survive another generation of ANC leadership. They talked about everything except the fact that they were walking closer together than professional colleagues should, that their hands kept brushing accidentally on purpose, that every breath felt charged with anticipation. When they reached the edge of the property, where the vineyards gave way to fynbos, and the land sloped sharply toward the valley below, El-Wazi stopped and turned to her. "I can't pretend anymore," he said. "I can't pretend this is just business. I can't pretend I don't think about you constantly. I can't pretend I don't want you in ways that probably violate several professional ethics guidelines and definitely complicate my employment status." Thandi should have ended it there, should have reminded him of all the reasons why this was impossible, should have been the adult, the responsible one. The person who protected them both from their own worst impulses, but instead she said, "Then don't pretend." They barely made it back to the house before his hands were in her hair and her back was against the wall of the entrance hall, and his mouth was on hers with a hunger that matched her own. They stumbled through rooms without seeing them, leaving a trail of discarded professional distance and abandoned self-control. And when they finally made it to her bedroom, to the enormous bed with its view of the mountains and the stars, when they finally allowed themselves to have what they'd been denying for weeks, Thandi felt something fundamental shift inside her, some last wall crumbling, some final defense falling. Afterward, lying in the darkness with El-Wazi's arm around her and his breathing slow and steady beside her, Thandi felt the first stirrings of what might have been regret or might have been fear, but was definitely awareness that she'd just complicated her life in ways she couldn't begin to calculate. She'd just given someone power over her, real power, the kind that came from intimacy and knowledge, and the ability to hurt her in ways that had nothing to do with business or money or public reputation. "What are you thinking?" El-Wazi asked softly, his fingers tracing idle patterns on her shoulder. "That I've just made either the best or worst decision of my life," Thandi admitted, "and I'm not sure which." "Does it have to be either?" His voice was gentle. "Can't it just be something you wanted, something that makes you happy?" "Happiness is expensive," Thandi said, "and I've spent my whole life learning to live without it because the cost was too high." "Maybe you can afford it now," El-Wazi suggested. "Maybe you've earned it." But earning things and having them were different, as Thandi knew better than most. And happiness, she'd learned long ago, was the most expensive luxury of all, because it required vulnerability, trust, the willingness to let someone close enough to destroy you. They fell into a pattern over the following months, a careful choreography of public professionalism and private intimacy. During business hours, they maintained appropriate distance, communicated through proper channels, behaved like consultant and client with nothing between them except work. But in the spaces between, in stolen evenings at her house when she'd dismissed her staff, in weekends at the wine estate where they could pretend to be normal people rather than powerful woman and younger lover, in hotel rooms in Cape Town and Durban, when business travel provided convenient cover, they allowed themselves to be simply Thandi and Elwazi, two people who wanted each other with an intensity that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. Thandi told herself she was managing the situation, that she was being strategic about the affair the way she was strategic about everything else. She varied the locations of their encounters to avoid patterns that might be noticed. She was careful about digital communication, deleting messages, avoiding phone calls that might be overheard or recorded. She maintained her public schedule, attended industry events and political fundraisers and society dinners, made sure she was seen being the Iron Queen who had no time for personal entanglements. She told herself she was in control, that she was handling this the way she handled everything, with discipline and planning and careful risk management. But control, she was discovering, was an illusion when it came to matters of the heart. Because with every late-night conversation, with every moment of vulnerability she allowed herself, with every time Elwazi looked at her like she was the only woman in the world, she was losing a little more of the careful distance she'd maintained her entire adult life. She was falling, had fallen, was in so deep that the thought of ending things felt physically painful. And Elwazi, for his part, seemed equally caught, equally unable to step back even though they both knew the situation was unsustainable. He talked about the future sometimes, in unguarded moments, about what they could build together, about how they could make this work if they were brave enough to stop hiding. He talked about loving her, not for her money or her power, but for the woman she was when all the armor came off, for her sharp mind and dry humor and unexpected kindness, for the vulnerability she showed only to him. "Come with me," he said one Saturday morning at the wine estate, when they were having breakfast on the terrace and the morning sun was turning the vineyards golden. "I've been invited to speak at a conference in London next month. Come with me. We could have a week together, somewhere nobody knows us, somewhere we could just be normal." "I'm one of the most recognizable women in South Africa," Thandi said, though the fantasy was tempting, dangerously so. "I'd be noticed. There would be questions. It's too risky." "Everything about this is risky," Elwazi pointed out. "At least in London we could walk down the street together, have dinner in public, not have to look over our shoulders constantly." "And when we came back," Thandi asked, "when people started asking questions about why we traveled together, when it became a story." "Then it becomes a story," Elwazi said. "Maybe that wouldn't be the worst thing. Maybe hiding is harder than being honest." But honesty, in Thandi's experience, was a luxury that powerful people couldn't afford. Honesty meant exposure, vulnerability, giving your enemies weapons they could use against you. And she had enemies, plenty of them, people who would love nothing more than to see the Iron Queen reduced to tabloid fodder, her personal life dissected and judged, and used to diminish everything she'd built. If you've ever kept a secret that felt both precious and dangerous, if you've ever lived in that space between fear and desire, then you understand why Thandi said no to London, why she insisted on maintaining their careful distance even as it was killing her. And if you're invested in this story, if you want to know how it all falls apart, then I need you to stay with me, because we're about to meet the person who will bring it all crashing down. His name was Marcus Chabalala, and he'd been part of Thandi's life for over 20 years, since the early days when she'd been building her first mining operation and needed investors who weren't terrified of a black woman with ambitions that far exceeded acceptable boundaries. Marcus had been one of the few who'd taken a chance on her, had provided crucial early funding, and used his political connections to help her navigate the complex world of mining rights and government contracts. He was 60 now, silver-haired and elegant, with the kind of old money polish that came from generations of privilege and the particular ruthlessness that came from fighting to maintain that privilege in post-apartheid South Africa. They'd been lovers once, briefly, in those early years, a relationship that had been more strategic than romantic, two ambitious people who'd found temporary comfort in each other while building their respective empires. The affair had ended amicably when it became clear they were better as allies than lovers, and they'd maintained a complex partnership over the years, business and political, and sometimes personal, built on mutual respect and shared interests, and the understanding that they could help each other in ways that benefited them both. Marcus had his own empire now, built on telecommunications and real estate and strategic investments in the right political relationships. He was connected, deeply connected, to the highest levels of ANC leadership, had the kind of access that money alone couldn't buy, the kind that came from knowing where bodies were buried and which battles to fight, and when to deploy pressure or favor or carefully orchestrated scandal. He'd helped Thandi more times than she could count, smoothing regulatory obstacles, providing intelligence about competitors, using his influence to protect her interests when political winds shifted. But he'd also been circling her for years, making it clear that he was interested in resuming their personal relationship, that he saw their history as unfinished business. Thandi had always deflected these overtures, maintaining their alliance while keeping him at arm's length personally, not wanting to complicate their professional partnership with romantic entanglement. And Marcus had accepted this, or appeared to, though there was always something slightly predatory in the way he looked at her, something that suggested he viewed her not as an equal but as something to be acquired, possessed, added to his collection of valuable assets. She should have seen him as a threat, should have recognized that a man like Marcus, with his resources and connections and intimate knowledge of her business, could be dangerous if their interests ever misaligned. But she'd been arrogant, confident in their partnership, certain that their mutual benefit would always outweigh any personal complications. That certainty died at a political fundraiser in Pretoria, one of those elaborate affairs where Johannesburg's elite gathered to display their wealth and influence while ostensibly supporting whichever ANC candidate seemed most likely to protect their interests. Thandi attended these events regularly, viewing them as tedious but necessary, opportunities to maintain relationships and gather intelligence and remind everyone that she remained a force to be reckoned with. She'd come alone, as she usually did, wearing a gown that had cost more than most people earned in a year, diamonds glittering at her throat and wrists. She worked the room with practiced ease, exchanging air kisses and empty pleasantries with people she barely tolerated, making small talk about business and politics while mentally cataloguing useful information and potential opportunities. She was in the middle of a conversation with a cabinet minister about renewable energy policy when she saw El-Wazi across the room, and her heart did something complicated and dangerous, some combination of longing and fear and pure joy at seeing him unexpectedly. He was dressed in a tuxedo that made him look unfairly handsome, talking to a group of younger businesspeople near the bar. Their eyes met across the crowded room, held for a fraction too long, and Thandi felt heat rise to her cheeks even as she forced herself to look away, to continue her conversation, to pretend she hadn't just had a visceral reaction to seeing her secret lover at a public event where discretion was paramount. She managed to avoid him for most of the evening, keeping to opposite sides of the room, making sure their paths didn't cross. But toward the end of the night, she stepped out onto the terrace for air, needing a moment away from the cloying crowd and false conversations, and found him already there, standing at the railing and looking out over Pretoria's lights. "We can't keep doing this," El-Wazi said without turning around, "pretending we don't know each other in public, acting like strangers when we're anything but." "We have to," Thandi said, though she moved closer, unable to help herself. "The alternative is too dangerous." "For you or for me?" El-Wazi turned to face her, and in the moonlight she could see frustration and hurt warring in his expression. "Because I'm tired of hiding. I'm tired of loving you in secret like it's something shameful." "It's not sham." Thandi started, but movement in the doorway made her step back, put distance between them, and she turned to see Marcus emerging onto the terrace, his eyes sharp and assessing, clearly having witnessed their close proximity and her guilty step back. "Thandi," Marcus said smoothly, though something cold flickered in his eyes, "I've been looking for you, and this must be the young consultant I've heard so much about. El-Wazi Dlamini, isn't it?" The fact that Marcus knew El-Wazi's name, that he'd been keeping track, made Thandi's stomach drop, because Marcus didn't pay attention to consultants unless they were threats or opportunities, and the way he was looking at El-Wazi suggested he'd been classified as the former. "Mr. Chabalala," El-Wazi said, extending his hand with professional courtesy that revealed nothing, "I've heard a great deal about you as well." "I'm sure you have," Marcus said, shaking his hand while keeping his gaze on Thandi. "Thandi and I go back many years. She tells me everything." The implied threat was subtle but unmistakable, a reminder that Marcus knew her well, had access to her business and her secrets, was positioned to cause significant damage if motivated to do so. And the way he was looking between them, calculating, assessing, suggested he'd already drawn conclusions about the nature of their relationship and was determining how to use that information to his advantage. "If you'll excuse me," El-Wazi said, apparently reading the situation correctly, "I should get back inside." He left without looking at Thandi, and she was grateful for his discretion, even as she mourned the loss of their brief moment of honesty, however risky it had been. "You're sleeping with him," Marcus said once they were alone. It wasn't a question. "That's none of your business," Thandi replied, keeping her voice level even as her heart hammered. "Everything about you is my business," Marcus countered. "I have too much invested in you, in your success, in our partnership, to stand by while you make stupid decisions that could damage both our interests." "My personal life doesn't affect our business relationship," Thandi said, though even as she said it she knew it was a lie. Everything was connected, especially in their world, where reputation and perception were as valuable as assets and influence. "He's 16 years younger than you," Marcus said. "He works for you. The power dynamic alone is scandalous. If this becomes public, you'll be torn apart. The media will paint you as a desperate older woman taking advantage of a younger employee. Your competitors will use it to suggest you're emotionally unstable, making poor decisions, losing your edge. Your political allies will distance themselves to avoid being associated with the scandal. Everything you've built could be damaged, and for what? For some boy who's probably interested in your money and your connections." "He's not a boy," Thandi said sharply. "He's a man, a brilliant one, and he has more integrity than most people I know." "Including me," Marcus's smile was cold. "Be careful, Thandi. You're defending him like he matters, which suggests this is more than just physical. You're emotionally invested, which makes you vulnerable. And vulnerable is a very dangerous thing to be in our world." "Is that a threat?" Thandi asked, though she already knew the answer. "It's a warning," Marcus said, "from someone who cares about your best interests. End it before someone less friendly than me discovers it and decides to make it public. End it before it costs you everything." He left her standing alone on the terrace, and Thandi felt the carefully constructed walls of her secret life beginning to crack. Because Marcus was right about one thing, she was vulnerable now in ways she'd never been before, exposed in ways that went beyond business or money or the usual calculations of power and risk. She'd given someone the ability to hurt her, had allowed herself to care about something more than her empire, and in their world that was the most dangerous gamble of all. She ended the evening early, claimed fatigue, and left the fundraiser without the usual rounds of farewells and final conversations. In her car, driving back to Johannesburg with her driver maintaining discreet silence in the front seat, she called El-Wazi. "We need to be more careful," she said when he answered. "Or we need to stop hiding," he countered. "Marcus saw us together, saw how you looked at me. If he figured it out, others will too. Maybe it's time to just admit what's happening between us." "You don't understand what you're asking," Thandi said. "You don't understand what it would cost." "Then explain it to me," El-Wazi said, "because from where I'm standing, the cost of hiding seems higher than the cost of honesty." But he was wrong about that, as Thandi knew and he would learn. Because in their world, in the rarefied air of extreme wealth and power where she operated, honesty was expensive beyond calculation. Honesty meant exposure, scrutiny, judgment. Honesty meant becoming a story, a scandal, a cautionary tale. Honesty meant everything she'd built becoming secondary to her personal life. The Iron Queen reduced to gossip and speculation and endless commentary about her choices, her age, her female sexuality in all its threatening, uncomfortable reality. She tried to explain this to him, tried to make him understand the particular prison of female power, the way women at her level were judged differently, more harshly, held to standards that applied to no man. She tried to explain that while male billionaires could have affairs with younger women, could divorce and remarry and indulge in personal drama without damaging their business credibility, women had no such luxury. A woman who allowed passion to override propriety, who chose personal happiness over professional image, who admitted to having desires that went beyond wealth and power and achievement, risked losing everything she'd fought to build. But El-Wazir, for all his brilliance and emotional intelligence, couldn't fully understand this because he'd never lived it. Had never had to navigate the particular minefield of being a powerful woman in a world that still expected women to be either respectable or passionate, but never both, that viewed female sexuality as either absent or dangerous, that punished women for having the same appetites and ambitions that made men interesting. They fought about it over the following weeks, careful fights conducted in private spaces where they could be honest, but fights nonetheless. He pushed for transparency, for courage, for choosing their relationship over fear. She insisted on caution, on protecting what they had by keeping it hidden, on understanding that their private happiness was less important than their public survival. It was an impossible position for both of them, made worse by the fact that they each had valid points, that there was no clear right answer, only difficult choices with painful consequences. And then Marcus made his move, though not in the way Thandi had expected. She'd anticipated a direct threat, some kind of blackmail or ultimatum, an explicit demand that she end the affair or face consequences. Instead, he went political, using connections and influence to entangle her in a crisis that would consume her attention and force her to choose between her business interests and her personal life. The crisis began with a leaked document, an internal report from one of her mining operations that detailed safety violations and environmental contamination that had been quietly covered up by her management team. The report was genuine, unfortunately, evidence of exactly the kind of corporate malfeasance that she'd always claimed to be above, that she'd built her reputation on avoiding. The leak went to multiple media outlets simultaneously, along with anonymous commentary suggesting that Thandi Cumulo's supposedly ethical empire was built on the same exploitation and environmental destruction as every other mining operation, that her green energy investments were merely greenwashing to distract from ongoing abuses. The story exploded across South African media with predictable fervor, because there was nothing the press loved more than bringing down a powerful woman, nothing that sold better than revelations that someone who'd claimed moral authority was actually just as corrupt as everyone else. Thandi's phone exploded with calls from her executive team, her lawyers, her political contacts, all demanding immediate attention and strategic guidance. Her stock prices dropped. Activist groups that had previously been neutral or even supportive began calling for investigations. Government officials who'd been allies suddenly couldn't be reached. And through it all, she had to maintain her usual image of unshakable competence, had to handle the crisis with the kind of decisive action that would demonstrate she was still in control, still the Iron Queen who couldn't be rattled or defeated. She gave press conferences and fired executives and launched internal investigations and made all the right moves to contain the damage and protect her empire. But the timing was deliberate, she knew, orchestrated to consume her completely, to leave her no time or energy for anything except survival. And when she finally managed a brief phone call with El-Wazir late one night, exhausted and emotionally wrung out, he asked the question she'd been dreading. "Did Marcus do this? Is this because of us?" "I don't know," Thandi lied, though she knew perfectly well that Marcus had orchestrated the leak, had used his connections to ensure maximum damage, had weaponized her own business practices against her as punishment for rejecting him and choosing someone else. "But it doesn't matter. I have to handle it." "Let me help," El-Wazir said. "I can do the environmental assessments, help with remediation planning, use my contacts with activist groups to help manage the public relations disaster." No, Thandi said sharply. You need to stay away from this. If people connect you to me right now, when I'm under this kind of scrutiny, it will only make things worse. So you're cutting me off. The hurt in his voice was painful to hear. You're ending this because it's inconvenient. I'm protecting both of us, Thandi said, though even she could hear how hollow it sounded. I'm being realistic about what we can survive and what we can't. They hung up without resolution, and Thandi threw herself into crisis management with the kind of single-minded focus that had built her empire. She hired new management for the problematic mining operations. She committed enormous resources to environmental remediation. She launched a transparency initiative that would subject all her operations to third-party oversight. She did everything right, handled the crisis exactly the way a smart, responsible business leader should, and slowly, painfully, managed to contain the damage and begin rebuilding her reputation. But it cost her in ways that went beyond money or business relationships. It cost her sleep and health and the fragile peace she'd found with El-Wazi. Because in choosing to handle the crisis the way she did, by putting her business first and demanding that he stay away, she'd confirmed Marcus's point, that her empire was more important than any relationship, that she would always choose power over passion, that she was exactly the cold, calculating woman everyone believed her to be. Share this story with someone who understands the impossible choices powerful women face, because this is where it gets even more complicated, where private pain and public scandal collide in ways that will change everything. The final rupture came 3 weeks later, at an ANC fundraising gala at a game lodge in the Bushveld near Kruger National Park, one of those extravagant events where the political and business elite gathered to drink expensive wine and pretend their donations were about ideology rather than access and influence. Thandi attended because missing such events during a crisis would signal weakness, would suggest she was too damaged to maintain her social and political standing. She wore armor in the form of a crimson gown that made her look powerful and untouchable, diamonds that announced her wealth, makeup and hair styled to perfection. She looked like exactly what she was supposed to be, the Iron Queen, undefeated, unshakable, unmoved by anything as mundane as scandal or criticism. Marcus was there too, playing the gracious host, working the room with the ease of someone who knew he was winning whatever game they'd been playing. He greeted Thandi with a warmth that fooled everyone except her, kissed her cheek in a way that suggested intimacy, placed his hand on the small of her back with an ownership that made her skin crawl. "You've handled things well," he murmured in her ear. "The crisis is contained. Your reputation will recover. You've proven once again that you're a survivor." "No thanks to you," Thandi said quietly, smiling for the benefit of anyone watching. "On the contrary," Marcus replied, "every thanks to me. I created a crisis that allowed you to demonstrate your competence and decisiveness. I gave you an opportunity to prove your value to everyone who matters, and in the process, I removed the distraction that was compromising your judgment." El-Wazi wasn't a distraction, Thandi said, though her voice lacked conviction even to her own ears. "He wasn't," Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Then why haven't you seen him in 3 weeks? Why did you choose your business over him when the crisis hit? You made the right choice, Thandi. You always do when it comes down to it. You're too much like me to ever really choose love over power." The truth of that observation stung more than any criticism could have, because Marcus was right. When forced to choose, she'd chosen exactly as he predicted, had sacrificed her personal happiness to protect her professional interests, had proven that at the end of the day, she was still the woman who valued power above all else. She was saved from having to respond by the arrival of additional guests, including several ministers and the party chairman himself, and Marcus moved away to greet them, leaving her standing alone with her expensive champagne and her uncomfortable revelations. And then El-Wazi arrived, unexpected and devastating in a tuxedo that made him look older, more polished, more like he belonged in this rarefied world. He was accompanied by a woman, Thandi noticed with a sharp twist of jealousy, someone young and beautiful and age-appropriate, someone who could stand beside him in public without raising eyebrows or starting whispers. They made a striking couple, and Thandi watched several heads turn to appreciate them, watch people's appreciative smiles at seeing young love, young beauty, young potential uncompromised by scandal or age difference or power imbalance. Elwazi saw her immediately. His eyes finding hers across the room with the same magnetic pull that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. But this time, instead of the usual warmth and desire, she saw hurt and anger and something that might have been betrayal. He excused himself from his companion and crossed the room toward her with determined purpose. "We need to talk," he said when he reached her. "This isn't the place," Thandi replied, acutely aware of people watching, of Marcus in particular watching with sharp interest. "Then when?" Elwazi demanded. "You haven't returned my calls. You've avoided my emails. You've made it clear that you're choosing your empire over anything we might have had together." "I'm protecting us both," Thandi said, though the words felt rehearsed hollow. "You don't understand the scrutiny we'd face, the damage it could cause." "I understand perfectly," Elwazi said. "I understand that you're too afraid to choose something real over something powerful. I understand that you'd rather be alone and untouchable than vulnerable and loved. I understand that Marcus was right about you." "Right about what?" Thandi asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. "He came to see me," Elwazi said, 2 weeks ago, told me that you'd never leave your empire for a relationship, that you'd always choose power over passion, that I was wasting my time thinking you could ever truly open your heart to anyone. He offered me money to end things quietly, to disappear and save you the embarrassment of having to do it yourself. The revelation hit Thandi like a physical blow, because of course Marcus had done that, had gone behind her back to eliminate what he viewed as competition, had tried to buy off Elwazi the way he bought off everyone else who inconvenienced him. "And did you take it?" she asked, though she wasn't sure which answer she wanted to hear. "No," Elwazi said. "I told him to go to hell. I told him that what we had was real, that you were worth fighting for, that I'd wait as long as it took for you to be brave enough to choose us over fear." "But you brought a date," Thandi observed, gesturing toward the beautiful young woman who was watching their conversation with undisguised curiosity. "Because I'm tired of waiting," Elwazi said. "Because you've made it clear what your priorities are. Because I deserve someone who's willing to be with me publicly, who's not ashamed of wanting me, who can choose me without calculating the cost to her reputation." The words were devastating precisely because they were fair. Thandi had no counter-argument, no defense, nothing except the truth, that she was exactly as afraid as he accused her of being, exactly as calculating, exactly as willing to sacrifice love for power. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, and meant it more than she'd meant almost anything in her life. "You deserve better than what I can give you." "I deserve you," Elwazi corrected. "Not the Iron Queen, not the billionaire, not the public image. Just you, Thandi, the woman who laughs at terrible jokes and drinks her coffee too sweet and is terrified of flying but does it anyway. I deserve the real you, and you deserve to be loved for who you actually are rather than what you've built. But you have to be brave enough to let that happen, and I don't think you are." He walked away before she could respond, returned to his date and led her toward the dining area where dinner would be served. And Thandi stood alone, watching him go, feeling something fundamental break inside her. Marcus appeared at her elbow moments later, offering her a fresh glass of champagne and a smile that held too much satisfaction. "Sometimes the kindest thing we can do for people is make choices for them," he said. "Protect them from their own poor judgment. Young Elwazi will recover. He'll find someone more suitable, and you can focus on what you're actually good at, which is building empires, not maintaining relationships." "Did you orchestrate all of this?" Thandi asked. "The leak, the crisis, approaching Elwazi, bringing him here tonight with a date. Was this all your way of proving a point?" "I orchestrated an opportunity for clarity," Marcus said, "for both of you to see what was always obvious, that you're not built for the kind of vulnerability relationships require, that you'd rather be powerful than happy, that you'd rather be right than loved." "And what do you get out of it?" Thandi asked, though she suspected she already knew. "You," Marcus said simply. "Eventually, when you're done pretending that what we had wasn't the most honest relationship of your life, We understand each other, Thandi. We want the same things. We're willing to make the same sacrifices. We could build something extraordinary together if you'd stop trying to have it both ways. The proposition was seductive in its honesty, in its acknowledgement of who she actually was rather than who she wished she could be. Marcus was offering her a partnership built on mutual ruthlessness, shared ambition, compatible damage. He was offering her someone who wouldn't ask her to change or soften or be vulnerable, who would accept her exactly as she was, cold and calculating and more interested in power than passion. And the terrible truth was that part of her wanted to accept, wanted to choose the easy path of compatibility and shared values, and a relationship that wouldn't require her to risk anything she wasn't willing to lose. But another part of her, the part that El-Wazi had somehow awakened despite all her defenses, wanted something different. Wanted to be brave enough to choose love over safety, passion over pragmatism, vulnerability over invincibility. Wanted to be the woman who could walk across this room and tell El-Wazi that he was right, that she was afraid but willing to try, that maybe being powerful and being loved didn't have to be mutually exclusive. She was standing at that crossroads, champagne in hand and heart in her throat, when her phone buzzed with an alert. A news notification, the kind that made her stomach drop even before she read it. Billionaire Thandi Cumulo's secret affair with employee exposed. Photos emerge of intimate relationship. The story had broken. Someone, almost certainly Marcus though she couldn't prove it, had leaked photos of her and El-Wazi at the wine estate, images that left no room for plausible deniability or professional distance. There she was, caught by some long-lens camera, kissing El-Wazi on the terrace, embracing him by the vineyards, looking at him with such naked longing that even she barely recognized the expression on her own face. The article that accompanied the photos was exactly as brutal as she'd feared, full of speculation about power dynamics and age differences, and whether a woman of her status should be conducting affairs with employees. It questioned her judgment, her professionalism, her fitness to lead the companies she'd built. It used words like predatory and inappropriate and scandalous, painting her as either a desperate older woman or an abusive boss, neither interpretation leaving room for the actual truth, that they genuinely loved each other, however complicated and impossible that love had been. Thandi looked across the room at El-Wazi, who was checking his own phone with an expression of dawning horror. Their eyes met, and in that moment she saw his future unraveling alongside hers, his reputation being destroyed by association, his career being reduced to speculation about whether he'd slept his way into consulting contracts and media attention. She saw him becoming a scandal rather than a person, his accomplishments and intelligence erased by gossip about his relationship with a powerful older woman. And she realized that Marcus had won after all, because he'd proven his point in the most devastating way possible, that her choices had consequences not just for herself, but for anyone who got close to her, that her world was so toxic and unforgiving that love became weaponized, that even her attempts at happiness would eventually hurt the people she cared about. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of crisis management and damage control. Thandi's lawyers were called, public relations specialists mobilized, statements drafted and redrafted. She gave a brief comment to the press that managed to say nothing while sounding appropriate, maintained her composure through dinner despite barely eating, held countless conversations with political allies and business partners who were either offering support or distancing themselves, depending on their own calculations of risk and benefit. El-Wazi tried to approach her several times, but she avoided him, couldn't bear to see the damage she'd caused to his life, couldn't face the accusation she knew she deserved. Instead, she let Marcus hover protectively, playing the role of concerned friend and business partner. Using his proximity to her as a subtle announcement of alliance and availability. Let people think she and Marcus were together, she decided. Let them speculate about whether her affair with El-Wazi had been a brief madness, before returning to someone more age-appropriate and powerful. It was damage control of a kind, allowing one narrative to eclipse another, giving the gossips something more palatable to discuss than the complicated truth. But late that night, after she'd finally escaped the gala and returned to her house in Johannesburg, after she'd dismissed her staff and poured herself a whiskey and stood on her terrace looking out at the city lights, El-Wazi appeared at her door. He'd somehow gotten past her security, or perhaps they'd let him through knowing he had legitimate business with their employer, and now he stood in her entrance hall looking disheveled and furious and heartbroken. "This is what you were afraid of," he said without preamble. "This exposure, this scandal, this public judgment. And you were right to be afraid, because it's exactly as brutal as you predicted." "I'm sorry," Thandi said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "I never wanted this for you, never wanted your life to become collateral damage in my war." "But you knew it could happen," El-Wazi said. "You knew the risks, and you pursued this anyway. You let me fall in love with you knowing that this was possible, probable, maybe even inevitable. Did you ever actually care about me, or was I just another acquisition? Another experience you wanted to have before going back to your real life?" "I loved you," Thandi said, and the past tense felt like a death. "I love you, but I also knew that loving you was selfish, dangerous, ultimately destructive. And I did it anyway because I wanted something for myself, something that wasn't about building or protecting or strategizing. I wanted to feel wanted, desired, seen as something other than the Iron Queen. And in pursuing that, I destroyed you." "You didn't destroy me," El-Wazi said, though his voice cracked slightly. "But you did prove that you're exactly what everyone says you are. Someone who will always choose power over people. Someone who can't actually be vulnerable enough for real intimacy. Someone who would rather be alone and untouchable than risk being hurt." "And maybe that's exactly what I am," Thandi admitted. "Maybe Marcus is right about me. Maybe I'm not built for the kind of love you deserve." "Or maybe you're just too afraid to try," El-Wazi countered. "Maybe the real tragedy isn't that we got exposed, but that you're going to use this exposure as an excuse to do exactly what you always planned to do. Walk away and go back to your safe, lonely empire where nothing and no one can hurt you." The accusation was fair, devastatingly so, and Thandi had no defense except the truth. That he was absolutely right, that she was already planning her retreat, already calculating how to minimize damage and protect her interests, and rebuild her reputation at the expense of their relationship. "What did you want me to do?" she asked, genuine curiosity mixing with her pain. "Stand by your side while the media tears us both apart? Fight for a relationship that most people find inappropriate at best and predatory at worst? Destroy what's left of both our reputations for the sake of love?" "Yes," El-Wazi said simply. "That's exactly what I wanted. I wanted you to be brave enough to choose us over fear. I wanted you to fight for what we had instead of surrendering to what other people think. I wanted you to prove that you're not actually as cold and calculating as everyone believes you are." "And if I can't," Thandi asked, "if I'm exactly as cold and calculating as everyone believes, if I'm fundamentally incapable of choosing love over power?" "Then I'll grieve for both of us," El-Wazi said, "because you'll have wasted your one chance at real intimacy, and I'll have wasted months loving someone who was never actually available." He left then, and Thandi didn't try to stop him, couldn't find the words that would make this better or different or anything other than the tragedy it had become. She stood alone in her beautiful house, surrounded by evidence of wealth and success and power, and felt more profoundly lonely than she'd felt in her entire life. The aftermath unfolded exactly as she'd feared. The scandal dominated South African media for weeks, with endless speculation and commentary and judgment. Her business suffered, with some partners distancing themselves and some contracts being quietly renegotiated and some political relationships becoming strained. The moral arithmetic was brutal. Being a powerful woman who'd had an affair with a younger employee was exponentially more damaging than being a powerful man who'd done the same thing. The double standard was flagrant, infuriating, and completely expected. But Thandi handled it the way she handled everything, with strategic precision and ruthless pragmatism. She gave carefully crafted statements that acknowledged poor judgment while maintaining that the relationship had been consensual and appropriate given that El-Wazi was an independent consultant rather than a direct employee. She leveraged her political connections to ensure the story didn't gain more traction than absolutely necessary. She used her wealth to support media outlets that treated the story fairly and to quietly pressure those that didn't. She survived, because survival was what she was best at. El-Wazi's professional reputation suffered too, though in different ways. Some viewed him as an opportunist who'd slept his way into lucrative consulting contracts. Others viewed him as a victim of an older woman's inappropriate attention. Neither characterization was fair or accurate, but fairness and accuracy had little to do with public narrative. He handled the scandal with more grace than Thandi would have expected, giving no interviews, making no public statements, simply continuing his work and allowing his professional accomplishments to speak for themselves. They didn't speak for months after that night at her house. The consulting contract was quietly terminated, the professional relationship ended by mutual unspoken agreement. Thandi told herself it was for the best, that a clean break was kinder than maintaining contact, that distance was the only way they'd both be able to move forward. But she missed him with an intensity that surprised her, missed not just the physical intimacy but the emotional connection, the conversations, the sense of being truly seen and understood by someone who didn't want anything from her except herself. Marcus predictably moved into the space El-Wazi had vacated, offering partnership and understanding, and a relationship built on compatible ruthlessness rather than inconvenient emotion. They began appearing together at social events, allowed speculation about a romantic relationship to develop naturally, used their combined political and business influence to mutual advantage. It was practical, strategic, exactly the kind of relationship that made sense for people at their level. But it wasn't love, and they both knew it. It was an alliance, a merge of interests, a pragmatic arrangement between two people who valued power over passion. And while there was something freeing about that clarity, something refreshing about a relationship that required no vulnerability or emotional risk, there was also something profoundly sad about choosing safety over desire, calculation over connection. If you're still with me, if you've stayed through this painful unwinding, then you understand why what happens next matters so much. Subscribe to hear how this story reaches its conclusion, because we're not quite finished yet. The turning point came 6 months later, at the annual Mining Indaba conference in Cape Town, where industry leaders from across Africa gathered to discuss the future of mining, sustainability, and economic development. Thandi was a featured speaker, invited to discuss her transition from traditional mining to renewable energy, positioned as an example of successful corporate evolution in response to environmental pressure. It was exactly the kind of professional redemption she'd been working toward, an opportunity to redefine her narrative and prove that the scandal hadn't diminished her influence or expertise. She delivered a brilliant speech, everyone said so afterward, articulating a vision for ethical extraction and environmental responsibility that managed to be both aspirational and pragmatic. She fielded questions with her usual competence, navigated contentious topics with diplomatic precision, demonstrated once again why she remained one of the most formidable figures in South African business. By all measures, it was a success, a definitive announcement that the Iron Queen remained unbowed and undefeated. But as she left the stage, moving through the crowd of well-wishers and sycophants and competitors offering grudging respect, she saw El-Wazi. He was standing near the back of the conference hall, arms crossed, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Their eyes met, and Thandi felt her carefully maintained composure threaten to crack, felt all the longing and regret and grief she'd been suppressing for 6 months rise up in her throat like bile. She should have looked away, should have continued toward the exit where Marcus was waiting to escort her to the next obligatory social event. But instead she changed direction, moved through the crowd toward El-Wazi with a deliberation that probably looked like confidence but felt like surrender. "Hello," she said when she reached him, and her voice was steadier than she'd expected. "That was an impressive speech," El-Wazi said. "You've perfected the art of saying all the right things without revealing anything true." The observation strung because it was accurate. "What are you doing here?" Thandi asked. "Same thing as you," El-Wazi replied. "Working, building a career, proving that I'm more than a scandal." "You were always more than that," Thandi said quietly. "I'm sorry if I ever made you feel otherwise." Something flickered in his expression, pain or longing or maybe just exhaustion. "Are you happy?" he asked abruptly. "With Marcus, with your life, with the choices you made, are you actually happy?" The question was devastating in its simplicity, and Thandi realized she had no good answer. Was she happy? By most objective measures, yes. Her business had recovered from the scandal. Her political connections remained strong. Her wealth continued to grow. She'd proven once again that she could survive anything, adapt to anything, emerge from any crisis still powerful and relevant. But happy, that was a different question entirely, because happiness, she'd discovered, required more than success. It required connection, vulnerability, the willingness to risk being hurt in exchange for the possibility of being truly known. And those were things she deliberately sacrificed in service of safety and control and the preservation of her empire. "No," she admitted, and the honesty felt both liberating and terrifying. "I'm not happy. I'm successful and powerful and respected, but I'm not happy." "Then why choose it?" El-Wazi asked. "Why choose power over happiness if power doesn't actually make you happy?" "Because happiness is temporary," Thandi said. "Because love ends and passion fades and people leave. But power endures. Success endures. The things I build will outlast any relationship." "But you won't," El-Wazi pointed out gently. "You'll die eventually, Thandi, like everyone else. And when you do, will it matter that you built an empire if you spent your whole life alone?" The question hit harder than anything else he could have said, because it articulated a fear she'd been avoiding for decades. That she might reach the end of her life and realize she'd won every battle except the ones that mattered, that she'd accumulated everything except what actually gave life meaning. Before she could respond, Marcus appeared at her elbow, polished and proprietary, placing his hand on the small of her back in that possessive way she'd learned to tolerate. "Thandi," he said smoothly, "we need to go. The transport minister is waiting, and you know how he gets when people are late." "I'll be right there," Thandi said, not taking her eyes off El-Wazi. "I'd rather not leave you alone," Marcus said, and there was an edge to his voice, a subtle warning that he'd noticed who she was talking to and didn't approve. "I said I'll be right there," Thandi repeated, with enough steel in her voice that Marcus, despite his own considerable power, backed off. He left, but not before giving El-Wazi a look that promised future consequences if he caused any trouble. And once they were alone again, or as alone as anyone could be in a crowded conference hall, El-Wazi said the thing that would eventually change everything. "I'm leaving South Africa," he announced. "I've accepted a position in London, working on sustainable development projects across Europe and West Africa. I'm leaving next month." The revelation felt like a physical blow, even though Thandi had no right to feel betrayed, no claim on his future, no standing to object to his choices. "Congratulations," she managed. "That's an incredible opportunity." "It is," El-Wazi agreed, "and I need it. I need distance from this country, from this industry, from you. I need to rebuild my life somewhere that doesn't constantly remind me of what I almost had and lost." "Because of me," Thandi said, "because I wasn't brave enough to fight for us. Because we were both trapped in a system that punishes women for having desires and men for being desired," El-Wazi corrected. "Because you were right that the cost of being together publicly would be devastating, but also because you chose safety over risk, calculation over courage, isolation over intimacy." "And if I asked you to stay," Thandi heard herself say, shocked by her own words, "if I said I was wrong, that I chose badly, that I want another chance?" El-Wazi looked at her for a long moment, and she saw the war in his expression, the part of him that still loved her wrestling with the part that knew better. "I'd say you're 6 months too late," he finally replied. "I'd say that I spent those 6 months hoping you'd be brave enough to come after me, to fight for what we had, to prove that you could choose love over fear. And you didn't. You chose Marcus and safety and the exact life you'd always planned to live. So no, Thandi, even if you asked me to stay, I wouldn't. Because I deserve someone who chooses me first, not as an afterthought, not when it's convenient, not after every other option has proven unsatisfying." He walked away then, and Thandi stood alone in the conference hall, surrounded by the noise of networking and deal-making and all the things she was supposedly good at, and felt something fundamental shift inside her. Because El-Wazi was right about everything. He deserved better than what she'd given him. He deserved someone brave enough to choose him without calculating the cost. He deserved happiness, even if she wasn't capable of providing it. But that realization, painful as it was, came with another, that she could choose differently going forward, that she didn't have to spend the rest of her life alone and untouchable, that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to become someone brave enough to risk vulnerability in exchange for connection. The final act of this story began 3 weeks later, when the scandal Thandi had feared most finally materialized. A whistleblower from Marcus's telecommunications, Empire released documents proving that Marcus had been involved in massive government corruption, using his connections to secure contracts through bribery and political manipulation, laundering money through shell companies, and leveraging his relationship with senior ANC officials to avoid prosecution for various crimes. The documents were comprehensive, damning, and absolutely genuine. The story exploded across South African media with even more fervor than Thandi's affair had generated, because this was the kind of corruption everyone suspected but rarely saw proven so thoroughly. Marcus was arrested within days, charged with dozens of crimes that would likely result in decades in prison if convicted. His company's stock prices collapsed. His political allies fled. His carefully constructed empire began to crumble with shocking speed. And because Thandi had been publicly associated with Marcus, because they'd been appearing together at events and allowing speculation about a romantic relationship, she was immediately pulled into the investigation. Not as a criminal suspect, her lawyers assured her, but as a witness, someone who might have knowledge of Marcus's business practices and political connections. The irony wasn't lost on her, that she'd chosen Marcus precisely because he was safe, powerful, someone who operated in her world according to rules she understood. And that choice had now put her in more danger than her affair with El-Wazi ever had, because association with criminal corruption was infinitely more damaging than having an inappropriate relationship. The investigation consumed months of her life, endless interviews with prosecutors and regulators, and parliamentary committees investigating government corruption. Thandi cooperated fully, providing information about Marcus's business dealings and political connections, using her own extensive records to help build the case against him. She was careful to establish that while they'd been business associates and social companions, she'd had no knowledge of his illegal activities and no involvement in his corrupt dealings. It was technically true, which was the best kind of true in legal proceedings, but it was also devastatingly revealing about her judgment, about her willingness to associate with people like Marcus, about the moral compromises she'd made in pursuit of power and protection. And as the investigation progressed, as more details emerged about the extent of Marcus's corruption and the damage his schemes had caused to the country's economy and political institutions, Thandi found herself doing something rare and uncomfortable, actually questioning whether the life she'd built was worth the cost. Because Marcus's crimes had been enabled by exactly the kind of system she'd spent decades navigating and exploiting, a system where wealth bought influence, where political connections could override justice, where powerful people protected each other at the expense of everyone else. She'd benefited from that system, had used it to build her empire, had never seriously questioned whether her own success was built on foundations as rotten as Marcus's. The realization was devastating, not because she was guilty of his specific crimes, but because she was complicit in the broader corruption that had made those crimes possible. She'd spent her whole life fighting to join the club of powerful people, and now she was discovering that the club itself was toxic, destructive, fundamentally opposed to the kind of justice and equality she'd once believed in. She was wrestling with these uncomfortable revelations late one night in her office, going through documents and memories, and trying to determine whether anything she'd built had actual value or whether it was all just sophisticated exploitation dressed up as success, when her assistant informed her that El-Wazi was in the lobby and asking to see her. Her heart did something complicated at the news, some combination of joy and terror and grief. He was supposed to be in London, was supposed to be building his new life far away from her and the toxicity of South African power politics. But here he was, back in Johannesburg, asking to see her at nearly midnight. "Send him up," Thandi said, and then spent the 5 minutes it took for him to reach her office trying to compose herself, trying to prepare for whatever this conversation would be. He looked different when he walked through her door, older somehow, more settled into himself. The months in London had been good for him, she could see that immediately. He'd lost the slightly haunted look he'd had in the aftermath of their scandal, had found some peace or purpose or distance that allowed him to be present without being wounded. "Hello, Thandi," he said, and his voice was gentle, free of the anger and hurt that had characterized their last conversation. "I thought you were in London," Thandi said, gesturing for him to sit in the chairs by the window, the ones with the view of Johannesburg's nighttime sprawl. "I was," Elwazi confirmed, "but I came back for the investigation. The prosecution wanted testimony about Marcus's environmental practices at his mining operations and about some consulting work I did for him years ago before I met you. I've been giving depositions for the past 2 weeks." "I didn't know," Thandi said, realizing how much she'd isolated herself these past months, how completely she'd withdrawn from everything except survival. "I know," Elwazi said. "You've been focused on protecting yourself, which is understandable given the circumstances. But I heard about your testimony, about how you've been cooperating with the investigation even though it's damaged your reputation and cost you some political relationships. That took courage." "It took self-preservation," Thandi corrected. "I'm cooperating because refusing would make me look guilty, and because my lawyers advised it was the best strategy." "Maybe," Elwazi allowed, "or maybe you're finally doing the right thing regardless of cost, which is something I never thought I'd see from you." The observation landed with unexpected weight, because he was right that cooperating with the investigation had cost her significantly. Some of her political allies had distanced themselves, worried that her testimony might implicate them in Marcus's schemes. Some business relationships had been damaged by her willingness to provide information that might hurt other powerful people. She'd effectively chosen truth over loyalty, principle over pragmatism, and it was costing her in ways that would take years to fully calculate. "Why are you here?" Thandi asked, because she couldn't bear the weight of hope mixed with fear, mixed with longing that his presence generated. "Because I saw your testimony," Elwazi said. "I saw you sitting in that parliamentary committee meeting, answering questions honestly even though honesty was damaging. I saw you acknowledge that the system you'd benefited from was corrupt, that your success had come at costs you'd never properly examined. I saw you being vulnerable and honest in public, which is the thing you've always been most afraid of." "And that matters why?" Thandi asked, though her heart was racing. "Because it proved you can change," Elwazi said simply. "Because it showed me that maybe you're capable of being the person I always believed you could be. Someone brave enough to choose truth over safety, principle over power, love over fear." "I'm not asking you to come back," Thandi said quickly, because she needed him to understand that she wasn't trying to manipulate him, that this wasn't another calculated move in some long game. "I know I don't deserve another chance. I know I hurt you badly and proved all your worst assumptions about me. I'm not asking for anything." "What if I'm offering anyway?" Elwazi said quietly. "What if I spent 6 months in London discovering that I'd rather have complicated, difficult, imperfect love with you than easy, simple relationships with people I don't care about as much? What if I came back not because you asked, but because I choose to?" The words hit Thandi like physical blows, each one cracking something inside her, breaking through defenses she'd spent decades building. "It won't be easy," she warned. "The scandal will resurface, people will judge us, your career will be complicated by association with me, my business relationships will be strained, we'll face constant scrutiny and speculation and criticism." "I know," Elwazi said, "and I'm choosing it anyway, because I'd rather have you and difficulty than safety and loneliness, because I believe you're worth fighting for, even if you don't quite believe it yourself yet." I'm 53 years old, Thandi said, articulating all the fears she'd been holding. You're 37. I'm at the peak of my career and you're building yours. Our lives are in completely different phases. The age difference will always be an issue, always be something people comment on and judge and use against us. So let them, Elwazi said. Let them judge and comment and speculate. We'll build our life anyway, on our own terms, with our own definitions of what works. And if it fails, if we try this and discover we're incompatible or that the obstacles are insurmountable, at least we'll have tried. At least we'll have been brave enough to fight for something real rather than surrendering to fear. Thandi looked at him, this man who'd somehow seen through all her defenses and loved the person underneath, who was offering her another chance even though she didn't deserve it, who was brave enough to choose love, even knowing all the costs and complications and difficulties it would entail. And she made a choice, finally, that wasn't about power or protection or strategic advantage. She chose him, chose vulnerability, chose the possibility of happiness even knowing it might not last, might not work, might end in heartbreak and regret. Yes, she said simply, yes to trying, yes to being brave enough to fight for this, yes to you. The epilogue to this story isn't neat or simple or conventionally happy, because real life never is. Thandi and Elwazi rebuilt their relationship slowly, carefully, with eyes wide open to all the difficulties they'd face. They went public deliberately, controlled their own narrative as much as possible, refused to hide or apologize for loving each other. The media attention was brutal at times, the social judgment exhausting, the professional complications significant. Some of Thandi's business relationships were damaged by the relationship. Some of Elwazi's professional opportunities were complicated by his association with her. But they built something real anyway, a partnership based on genuine intimacy and mutual respect, and the willingness to be vulnerable with each other. Thandi learned, slowly and imperfectly, to choose love over fear. To risk being hurt in exchange for being truly known, to value connection as much as she valued power. Elwazi learned to navigate the complexities of loving a powerful woman, to hold his own ground while supporting her, to build his own career and identity rather than being defined entirely by their relationship. And Marcus, he was convicted on multiple counts of corruption, sentenced to 20 years in prison, his empire dismantled, and his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale about the costs of unchecked greed and political manipulation. His downfall became a symbol of everything wrong with South African power politics, and Thandi's role in helping convict him became part of her own redemption narrative, evidence that even the Iron Queen could choose principle over loyalty when confronted with genuine corruption. 5 years after that night in her office when Elwazi came back, Thandi stood on the terrace of her wine estate in Stellenbosch, watching the sunset paint the vineyards in shades of gold and amber. Elwazi was beside her, his hand warm in hers, and they were discussing plans for a foundation they were building together, one focused on environmental sustainability and economic justice in mining communities. It was work that combined her resources with his expertise, that allowed them to use their power for something beyond personal enrichment. "Do you ever regret it?" Elwazi asked quietly, "choosing this life with all its complications over the simpler path you could have taken?" Thandi considered the question seriously, because she'd never been one for easy platitudes or false sentiments. Did she regret the professional costs her relationship had imposed, the business relationships that had been damaged, the political capital she'd spent defending their love against public criticism and social judgment? "No," she said finally, and meant it completely. "I regret the years I spent alone. I regret the time I wasted choosing power over passion. I regret not being brave enough to fight for us 6 months sooner, but I don't regret any of it since I finally made the right choice. Because this complicated, difficult, imperfect love is the best thing I've ever built, better than the mining empire, better than the renewable energy investments, better than any fortune or accolade or evidence of success. This is the thing that will matter at the end of my life, the thing I'll be grateful I was brave enough to choose." Elwazi pulled her closer, kissed her temple with a tenderness that still, after 5 years, made her heart race. And Thandi, the Iron Queen who'd spent her whole life being untouchable, allowed herself to be touched, to be vulnerable, to be loved in all her complicated, flawed, gloriously human imperfection. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something real about love and power and the costs of choosing one over the other, then share it with someone who needs to hear it. Comment below about what choices you've made, what battles you've fought, what you've learned about balancing ambition with intimacy. And follow for more stories that explore the complicated realities of love, power, and what it means to be truly brave in a world that punishes vulnerability. Because in the end, that's what this story has always been about. The courage required to choose love in a world that teaches us to choose power, the bravery necessary to be vulnerable in a culture that values invincibility, and the revolutionary act of allowing yourself to want something more than survival, something as dangerous and beautiful and fundamentally human as being loved for exactly who you are.